Hi, Lulie. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, great to be here.
To start, I'd love for you to describe your untypical childhood and the parenting philosophy you were raised under.
Yeah, so I was raised under something called taking children seriously, which was philosophy developed by David Deutsch and Sarah Fitzclarridge and other people. And effectively, it was that I didn't go to school, uh, and that was an option for me. Like I could have gone to school, and in fact, when I was 16, I tried it out for a few months to see what it was like. It was basically what I expected, so I left. And everything I did was myself driven, so I just like followed my own interests.
Can you describe how it was like? Was there any structure whatsoever, or were you just allowed to choose anything that came up in your mind as interesting?
Yeah, I mean, even the framing "allowed to choose" is sort of like when you think of your friend, you wouldn't say, "Oh yes, I allowed him to choose like whatever he was in." No, like I'm a person. I follow my interests. So yeah, I mean, a lot of it was me following my own interests. Either like I would ask questions, or I would Google it, or I would like want books or something, and then I would follow through my interests like by reading books or documentaries or anything. So it was incredibly. I mean, it's exactly what I do now. It's like I have interests and I follow them.
Nice. How is it trying to socialize then and make friends in your situation where you weren't going to school, as you said, and presumably not everyone you would meet at the local park, say, would have parents who were taking them seriously in the philosophical sense. So, did you face any problems with socializing?
Not prom if anything, when I was 16 and I decided to go to school, I was surprised at how like weird the socializing was there, because you just didn't have time to go in depth. Like I was used to. So first of all, I we were part of different home education groups, and so we lived in London at this time, and so there were a lot of kids who also had kind of similar stuff to me. In addition to that, like just hanging out with school kids locally in the area. And I don't know, like I never really found that much of a problem socializing, even though I was an introvert, and so I would be at home a lot playing video games and so on. But I was used to having long, in-depth discussions. And then when I was 16 and I tried out sixth form college, which is like the British equivalent of high school, I found that it was almost like people pretended to know each other better than they did. It's like, but I haven't had a 4 hour long conversation with you about philosophy yet. Like how like this is interesting. So it felt like it took longer to build up those friendships in the school setting.
I think it's also weird that when you're in school, you're kind of forced to be around people that you might not like, right? But when you're, again, following your own interests, you can follow uh, friendships that are interesting to you and people that you'd like to meet. But in school, it's like, no, this is the class and these are the people you're going to see every day, even if you don't want to see them. And sometimes, like some schools are more liberal, but um, in some of the schools I've been into, we actually couldn't even decide whom we were going to sit next to. So that was decided by the class teacher. So that can actually sometimes have an adverse effect on socializing. And that can, sometimes cause people to not really like people that much because, again, you're not allowed to allowed to choose people that you really
Like
want to be
freedom of
socializing.
association. Yeah.
Exactly. So
Yeah, I was actually really surprised because so I was home educated, but in England, I would say most home educators are sort of more hippie type people, and then in America, most home educators, as far as I can tell, are more religious type people. And my family was sort of neither. We were libertarian,
mm,
but I was really surprised when I found out that so even in religious homeschool, bullying isn't really a thing. And in all of the homeschooling that I've seen, like bullying just like does not happen. It turns out if you have freedom of association, bullying is just not a thing. Uh and also I noticed with kids who like kids I hung out with locally who are school kids, whenever they were with other school kids, they would just get like very mean and just like become just very mean. And but whenever they were hanging out with me and my sister, they were like fine, and it was nice to hang out with them. Like individually, it was nice to hang out with them. But then when they got into these like school related like groups, then they suddenly became mean. And I always found that kind of interesting and confusing. But I guess now in hindsight, it's obvious why.
It's almost inconceivable to some people to grant this kind of freedom to children. And before reading Deutsch, I think I may have implicitly known that there was something wrong in the way children were treated at a societal level, but only after deeply understanding epistemology and learning about taking children seriously did I actually recognize the serious mistakes of authoritarianism in parenting and really authoritarianism everywhere else. Why do you think society is so against granting this kind of freedom to children?
I think part of it is that people think that children are a different category of person compared with adults. Like they think, children's brains are not fully developed, and therefore that means that we should control them. So that's one kind of big thing. And I wonder whether it's something like that parenting memes must have evolved to be the most the place where, so if we go back to the beginning of Infinity, it talks about these two different types of meme. There's rational memes like science, and these memes transmit by being useful and by standing up to criticism. But anti-rational memes transmit by disabling their holders' critical faculties. And the only way really to do that is to entrench hang-ups and irrationalities and so on from when you're quite young. And so memes to do with parenting and education have the highest selection pressure to be anti-rational. And so like that's a very high level, like maybe that's true. And then also I guess like parenting is very difficult. Like any kind of close relationships are very difficult, but parenting is sort of especially difficult. And so I think people are on edge a lot, and they're just like trying to find some kind of way to deal with the situation. And so I think all of these things sort of mix together to produce the society that we see. But also it's like, I don't know, TCS is what, like 30 years old at this point. And so it's not that well known. And yeah, but I really think it comes down to you're thinking about what is a person, and like what is possible to learn when you're young, and how does learning work, and does it work by the bucket theory of the mind as Popper criticized, and the whole school system is built on that, or does it work by following your own interests? So
how did you get interested in epistemology?
I think originally it was that when I was a teenager, just sort of naturally, I'd be talking to other kids and talking about ideas, and then, let's see, I remember arguing with people on message boards about morality when I was like 14 or something, maybe 13, and then the thing that really got me into it was that when I went to school, I went and I did a philosophy class, and I discovered that there are foundationalists in the world, and then I started like, because I'd grown up with Popper, like I'd grown up under Popper applied to education, and so then I got like more like deeply interested in, okay, what does this actually mean? How is this different from other like people?
So I think a lot of the ideas, like, kind of a rebellion against authority, or just not thinking of authority as this infallible being, was implicit in your upbringing in childhood.
Right. Yeah. If anything, the opposite. Like a fairly anti-authoritarian sort of situation.
You're one of these unique people in the critical rationalist community who ties these ideas to psychology and the social sciences, but of course you don't think of those subjects in the conventional academic way. Why do you say social science isn't science, and what can the current academic disciplines of psychology, sociology, and the social sciences in general learn from epistemology?
Yeah, the reason that I think it's not a science is that human minds are basically governed by this epistemological thing that Popper described, which includes that we have creativity and we have the ability to have any thought that is possible to have, that we are universal. And once you have something that is not predictable, that is inherently not predictable because it involves creating new knowledge, you can't make predictions, and so you can't do physical science on it. I think that there are probably some branches of psychology that are science, like maybe there's a sort of low-level neurological stuff, and that seems fine to me. But whenever you get a field that now depends on what ideas do people have, and you can do a test on them, and that might change their ideas, and then at the end of the test they're different, and all of this sort of thing can influence what you're actually studying. And so really it's more like the study of ideas and culture, and what are the memes, and how do people usually respond to these things. And yeah, like I kind of think of psychology, like the useful parts of psychology are more in things like how does trauma work, or how do hang-ups get entrenched in the first place. And I think psychology has discovered a bunch of cool stuff around that.
Interesting. Mainstream psychology seems to portray a tragic view of humans as these inherently irrational creatures with all these biases, and that's compelling to a lot of people. I mean, it was compelling to me, and I think Richard Dawkins coined the term middle world, this idea that humans experience a realm between the world of atoms and quarks and the world of stars and galaxies, and that the universe is queerer than we can suppose. I'd love for you to debunk some of these popular branches of psychology, like evolutionary psychology. And about neurology, you've said before that psychology would do well to study its foundations, which is not neurology, but indeed epistemology. So maybe those two we could start with.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can debunk it in a very short way, but I can maybe give some pointers.
Sure.
Which is the main thing is that all of our biological inclinations and everything are still subject to interpretation. So because we have this universal ability to think about any idea, any biological drive can be reinterpreted. And given that we have memes, not just genes, there has also been evolutionary pressure for all of the or as much content as possible to go from genes to memes. Like basically, if some memes can do a behavior, then because memes can evolve so much faster, then there's more evolutionary pressure for that behavior to be taken over by memes. So that's a sort of a general reason that I think that there is a tendency towards memes taking kind of the evolutionary brunt of the work. Now, I think memes are also harder to get rid of. Like they get more entrenched. They can adapt faster. Whereas genes, like, okay, yeah, you have a fear of heights, and then you can reinterpret that as excitement. Like genes tend to be quite dumb, like simple. I would also say, by the way, so David Deutsch did a podcast with Do Explain. I think it was episode 10. Yeah, episode 10 on Do Explain, where he goes into more of the evolutionary psychology stuff, which I quite liked.
Nice. And what about neurology? You said that psychology would do well to study its foundations, which is not neurology, but epistemology. Why would you say that?
Because if you're interpreting people and people behavior just as these dumb mechanistic things, then that is ignoring the vast majority of what a person is, which is someone who can create new knowledge, and someone who has culture, and and where there's these anti-rational and rational memes that are vying for control, maybe. So, and if you think about it, like what is the kind of the most basic sort of piece? And I would say that it's like I think epistemology is most fundamental because it's about how does information like move from one system to another, or how does it get created, or how does that, like everything is basically governed by knowledge and the power of knowledge to make changes. And so because psychology is about people, then that's where I would like go into.
You gave a talk titled Applied Philosophy about 12 years ago, and people can watch it on YouTube, where you discuss some of these ideas we've been talking about. And in that talk, you say, quote, "Any one of us could revolutionize psychology by writing a book or paper on memes." Has anyone you know gone ahead and tried to write about this? Has there been any progress yet?
Not really. I've seen, yeah, I would say not really, but also the more that I've learnt about actual psychology, the more I think I was just missing a lot 12 years ago when I was, 20 or whatever, however old that was. I think that the meme theory would have to be developed a lot to be practical and applicable, and even to account like there's a way that meme theory can account for like the big things, like why does science work, and why does religion kind of not work but kind of work, but even there are kind of questions about it. And then like, oh well, we can guess that parenting is subject to anti-rational memes, and so and so you can kind of see them like in that small scale. But what meme theory I feel like hasn't fully accounted for is the more like medium scale, like what are systems of, let's say, personality traits that cause either those personality traits or the opposite to get transmitted to the next generation. So like for example, if you are narcissistic in the psychological sense, and if you require your children to be perfectionist and to always impress you, and then that transmits like particular hang-ups in them, like that's a whole kind of field, and that's what a lot of psychology does indeed study. They just don't call it meme theory.
So I used to think, or perhaps I still think, that when humans artificially evolve into these higher beings, maybe cyborgs, then like the whole field of psychology, at least now the conventional way, which is also pretty diverse now. So like a lot of psychology will become redundant, because then humans won't be driven by these urges that they evolved for in the African savannas. But maybe the kind of psychology you're describing doesn't have to go anywhere even after we become cyborgs, or it applies to any or all alien civilizations with technology even far superior to ours right now.
Yeah, I mean, one question I have is, which of the biological inborn ideas do you actually need for consciousness? Like this is maybe where Deutsch and I like slightly depart, or I don't know, I'm sort of still thinking about it, but I'm inclined to think that some of the physical things may indeed even be needed for consciousness. And I think David Deutsch thinks like not really, or that you just need some kind of input, and then you can artificially make the input or something. So when you say when we become cyborgs, I kind of think, well, there's going to need to be some kind of equivalent in the cyborg body. Like they may have different inborn ideas, but there's going to be we don't know what consciousness is. We don't know like how creativity works, but possibly there will be some kind of like physical related thing. And I was just on this the Do Explain podcast with Jake Orthwain, and they're talking about meta rationalism or meta rationality, David Chapman stuff, and they think that epistemology works by interaction with the environment. And so if that were true, then actually like having a physical body would be intimately related to this consciousness thing. And so I don't really know what the answer is yet. I'm still sort of like learning about all of these different worldviews.
Sure. We're seeing so many people talk about artificial intelligence and GPT-4 apparently being the seeds for AGI. So I can't miss asking you, what could perhaps AI safety experts learn from this different kind of psychology that we're talking about?
AI safety. Psychology. Like my first thought about AI safety is more that it's about epistemology than about psychology, because I am skeptical that it is possible to have a super intelligence, because I think of intelligence as this binary thing. So people have it, and other people and other entities don't have it. And I think that when we make AGI, it will just be another type of person. This is assuming that critical rationalism is true, which we'll see. Yeah, as for psychology, I don't know. Mostly just non-coercion, I would guess, because if you're creating this person and then you're enslaving it, that is not very pleasant, and also not very good for their learning and various stuff like that.
Right. So switching gears a bit, you have a great post called Criticism, Scheduling, and Privacy, where you explain why being in control of when, how, and what you get criticism on is a vital part of the growth of knowledge, and that criticism purely isn't a good thing. So at first it kind of sounded to me like a heretical taught to critical rationalism, because as if you were suggesting that we should limit the means of error correction, but you actually write, quote, unwanted criticism can effectively destroy the means of error correction and the growth of knowledge. So please explain.
Yeah, the most fundamental thing about all of my worldview and everything I think, no matter whether I'm like feeling like a critical rationalist one day or a meta rationalist or an Alexander technique person or anything, is this idea of non-coercion. And so the way that this relates to criticism is that the growth of knowledge can only work if you are following your own interests and problems. And if you are either handing that over to an authority to decide what your problems are, or to an authority to decide what the answers are, or an authority to decide which criticisms are valid for whatever your problems are, all of these things are a type of authoritarianism. Like they all say, never mind about the quality of the ideas, let's just like hand it over to an authority. And so when it comes to taking in criticism, there are an unlimited number of criticisms that you could be considering at any one time. So how do you even narrow that down to something that's useful? And so if someone is giving criticism indiscriminately, then that can affect the way that you think about things, and it can take you down paths that are not as good as if you could control the type of information that you're getting, so that you can get something that's really tuned to what you're interested in.
So are you suggesting like I'm the authority of the criticism that I want to take in, or like I'm in control of it? So wouldn't that also lead to some kind of authoritarianism, just turning it to myself?
Yeah, it's I think there's a way that you could do that. Like if you decided in advance, like, I will only accept criticisms that mention the color blue, or I don't know, like whatever arbitrary thing, which is when you're kind of deciding at the outset, and then effectively that's a bit like there's a sub-agent in you that is forcing a particular thing. It's more like the logic of your problem will determine which thing makes sense, or which thing feels exciting to pursue or fun. And so like a human mind is like very complex and has a lot of different parts, and has internal contradictions and so on. And there's a really cool thing that happens when something is promising, where it's sort of this is related to the fun criterion video that I did with David, which is about that fun is when your explicit ideas about something and your inexplicit or subconscious ideas about something align, and then you can just like really kind of go for it. It's a bit like getting into flow. It's like you don't have any current criticism of that being the right path. And so that's the sort of situation where criticism would be good. It's like, yeah, like this seems cool.
So I think I'm kind of getting it, but if you can be, your feelings can somehow keep you against some kind of ideas, some kind of criticisms that you don't want to take into account, which might be like an idea that you hold very dearly, but you don't want to, maybe it's mostly wrong, that's why like a criticism, which is a valid one perhaps, but you're not really taking that into account because you're driven by this emotional you, and you just don't want to take that account. So yeah, kind of how do you tie that with like yourself and wanting to actually have your ideas criticized? Because obviously you and I both know that that's how we make progress, and that's how we learn, part of how we learn.
Before you resolve the emotional problem, you can't really tell whether it's whether it's like a purely irrational hang up or something, or whether it has some information in it. And so to just say, this is emotional, therefore I won't listen to it, like that's also a type of authoritarianism. That's sort of siding with the explicit ideas. And I would say sort of like quite often to always, there is something that the underlying emotional or hang-up shaped or irrationality shaped thing is sort of trying to get at, but there is a misconception at a different level. And so then the answer is not to just sort of proceed and pretend that criticism, like, that doesn't count, but it's more like, so there's this subject which I want to make progress on, like whatever, I'm doing some physics problem or something, and then there's the thing, the other subject which is causing the first one to get messed up. And so the other subject might be like, I don't feel motivated to work on this problem because I feel like I'm not good enough, and I feel like if I try, then I'm just going to fail, and that will be humiliating and whatever. Like all of that stuff is sort of potentially real things in the world. Like maybe you actually do not know how to deal with like rejection of your peers or something. And so all of that is still a valid area to go into, and either one of these can be addressed sort of independently. But to just say, this doesn't count because it has that sort of quality, like it could be that actually that thing that you thought, that's just like my own hang-ups about my own like self-esteem, maybe it's saying, no, actually I don't really want to do physics. Like maybe this physics thing was just something that I did because that's what my parents wanted me to be, and maybe actually I want to be a ballet dancer, or whatever it is.
How important is it to be trying to make these inexplicit ideas explicit? And I'm assuming it's like the same way, like you learn about anything, you just guess and check. That's how you try and make the inexplicit stuff explicit.
Yeah, I used to think that that all inexplicit stuff should be made explicit, because then you can criticize it, and then you can make progress and so on. And I've come to think that, so first of all, I think that's impossible. Like that like there is always going to be so much more inexplicit knowledge than the surface level explicit thing. And so the thing is, when do you make it explicit? And then I would say something like when you encounter a problem, like when you get stuck on something. And also there are ways of addressing the inexplicit ideas without necessarily making them explicit. Like there are a bunch of different techniques in psychology and personal development and therapy and so on that can allow you to update the inexplicit ideas even without necessarily having them go through the wordy thing. So Eugene Genlin's focusing is I think the best example of this.
Can we delve into that a bit? Because I know you're also into personal psychology and Alexander technique and other mindfulness areas. So earlier I kind of came from that side where I was into first dual mindfulness and then non-dual mindfulness, kind of the Sam Harris thing. And it was very tough for me to be really connecting these two ideas of critical rationalism and mindfulness, because they just couldn't seem to tie well with each other. So, but you've talked a lot about mindfulness and other techniques of mindfulness. So I'd just love to hear maybe you talk about those things in terms of critical rationalist terms.
Yeah, by the way, I'm just very curious, like, so you discovered all of this like mindfulness stuff, and then you also discovered critical rationalism, and so is it like you just don't see the connection, or?
Not really. So in the non-dual mindfulness thing that Sam Harris talks about, it's like there, he talks about there is no self, and he talks about free will and all that, which we could delve into, but I sort of take the stance that free will is, again, an emergent phenomenon,
Yeah.
which is different from kind of what Sam Harris is talking about. And he talks about, seeing your experiences and really observing your experiences, and then you're like the authority, and then you understand the world
Right.
and nature and stuff.
Very,
and
very, very not critical rationalist.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
but still, I kind of, at first at least, I couldn't really make sense of both of those things together, but
Yeah.
now I kind of just tend more towards critical rationalism than meditation. So it's just kind of their meditation right now.
I think, so much to say. So on like the Sam Harris stuff, I think at least a lot of what he's saying sort of makes sense in itself, but is then translated quite poorly into critical rationalist terms. So like if you hear him use these terms, you're going to think that he's saying something that is like very, very, empiricist and against free will and sort of like how do we even make sense of creativity and all of that in his framework. And then there's the sort of what is meditation and non-dual practices and everything getting at. So I haven't done a lot of meditation, mostly because I kept hearing these stories of people who say, yeah, I've been doing 30 minutes a day for like the past 5 months, and I'm not really getting anything from it. I'm like, why would you spend so much time doing that if you're not getting anything from it? So I kind of thought like, meh, meditation, meh. And then I discovered, as you say, Alexander technique, and specifically the Peter Knoeb's Michael Ashcroft style, which is, I think, quite unique even in the Alexander technique world, which also, as far as I can tell, is very close to non-dual awareness meditation, it turns out. There are lots of unexpected connections in the world. But okay, so how does it connect to critical rationalism? I said earlier that my main thing is non-coercion, non-authoritarian, like epistemological non-authoritarianism.
Right.
How do I describe this? I think a lot of what meditation is getting at is how to reduce the non-productive meta discussion that is going on in your mind. So in other words, you've got this voice that's constantly saying things in your mind and commentating on everything that you're doing and criticizing you and making you self-conscious and wondering like, oh, how is this going to go, and fretting about like how well did that situation go and all this sort of thing. And all of this meta discussion is, first of all, it's a distraction from the actual content of whatever you're thinking about. So you want to work on this physics problem, and then you have all of these thoughts about yourself about like, oh, I'm not good enough to do this, or my friend Jeff has already like solved 3 problems this week, or whatever. I'm making this up, but so that's kind of one aspect of it. And then there are particular, very common ways that this meta discussion manifests. So there's the inner critic, which a lot, psychology therapy talks about. There's this thing where we're we are kind of planning for the future or thinking ahead to the future or thinking like, I want to do this project because it'd be so cool if I have had done that. Like, it would be so cool if that was a thing that I did. But instead of, I'm enjoying it now as I'm going along. So it's like, I want to have this amazing website, and then there's the work of actually like creating the website. And if you're thinking like, I just want this website already, then each bit of work on the website will be soul destroying, because it's actually not what you're like thinking about,
Right.
because you're thinking ahead. And likewise, if you're having all of these regrets about the past and you keep thinking about, I said this thing and that was so embarrassing and so on, neither the future nor the past is something that you have any control over. Like, you can only affect what you are doing right now. And so all of these thoughts are ridiculous. I don't know how else to put it. It's sort of like, it does not make sense to have those thoughts, because you exist now. You can affect what you do now. That's great. And also, you can think of these big picture things like having a website in the course of doing all of these things now. But if you're kind of constantly thinking into the future, then you're missing out on all of this life in the meantime.
Well, just something out there. A lot of people have this idea that humans are rational because they can think of the future, and because we can, really think of the future and not care about whatever impulse that we have in the moment. That's what makes humans rational creatures and separates us from the animals. So how does that fit into this frame?
Yeah, I think it's partly it's that we can make abstractions, and so we can think about sort of general situations, like, what is a general principle by which I would want to live my life? Like, if I made something a principle, and then I followed it, and then 90% of the time it gave me better results than if I didn't have that principle, then you might want to follow it even in the 10% of the time when it doesn't give a good result. So like, laws are a good example of this. Like, yeah, like it's not always necessary to wear a seatbelt, but if you have that as a principle, then on average, then you're going to, survive more car accidents.
Right.
And then there's the thing of something like that. If you're thinking of the future as being part of the present, I don't know if this makes sense, but it's something like, you're not only thinking about the future and you're not only thinking about the present, you're thinking about them all sort of as one thing. And then that's where the cool stuff happens, because then you can be like, I think it'd be really cool to have this 10-year long project where I start this company and we gradually build and everything. And then each moment of okay, I have to find investors, I have to fill out these forms. Each of those moments in the context of the bigger 10-year goal becomes enjoyable. But then there's this state of like only doing it because you want the end result, and then that's the non-enjoyable thing.
Right. Sorry, we sidetracked a bit.
Yeah.
Going back to connecting mindfulness and critical rationalism.
Yeah, so I think it's something like partly it is noticing where we get stuck in our thinking, like what actually causes us to not be these geniuses who are extremely productive and so on. And I would say that that's you could think of it like hang-ups, you can think of it like this type of thinking that does not work, which is this meta discussion thing, at least meta discussion in the way that it doesn't work, which is this particular. So like, when meta discussion is tearing down your ability to trust yourself, like to trust your own thinking, then you get stuck, because then you can't like trust any of the thoughts that you have. Or when meta discussion is constantly pulling you away from the thing you're trying to think about, then again, like that doesn't work. I think there are types of meta discussion that can be helpful. Like if you're stuck on something and then you pop out a layer, and you can use meta to be like, oh, I was stuck on that thing. And that is a
Mm.
meta statement, but it can still allow you to get back on a better path.
So, and sometimes even recognizing meta can get us out of that state.
Yes,
Like,
I think.
yeah, I guess, like, not me particularly, but maybe we can have someone who, recognizes that they're going meta and they go even more meta because they're now worried that they're in meta, and that just keeps happening. But yeah, is there a better way to perhaps get out of meta or do something?
Yeah. So apart from just noticing it, redirect focus to the thing that you're interested in. It's sort of like subjectively, it feels like there's something that is slightly distracting and kind of pulling you away, and then you can just be like, oh no, like that's not the thing, and then you can sort of redirect focus. Alexander technique has a very specific technique for doing this, which it misleadingly calls inhibition. But that's maybe a can of worms. But there are specific techniques for doing this if it seems difficult.
I think you recently discovered something very exciting on Twitter. I forget exactly what it is, but it was something about Buddhism and yeah, yeah. You want to describe that?
Yeah, this was like last week, and it blew my mind. So I'd always heard that Buddhism says that the root of all suffering is desire. And so in order to not suffer, you get rid of desires. And I thought that sounds terrible. That sounds the opposite of everything that I want in my life. Like desire is fun. Like how do you like why are we anti-pleasure all of a sudden? Like what's going on here? And then it turned out that the word that sometimes gets translated as desire is basically mistranslated as that. Like a closer translation would be something like fixated. Like you are fixated on something. So there's something that I want, and I really want that, and I can't kind of like want other things, or if I get other things then I'll be sad and I have to have this thing. Which is also has a direct parallel in Alexander technique. Like in Alexander technique, that kind of mode is called doing. Um, and so I realized that the core concept of Buddhism, which is that you should drop this thing, I had completely misunderstood. Like it is much closer to being able to think any thought, like as in have any want. Like it's sort of like something can come up and you can like it and desire it, and that's cool. And then if you don't get that, then instead of being like, oh no, like I don't have that thing I want, I feel so bad and everything, you can be like, oh okay, I didn't get that thing, and now this thing is here. And then you can really acknowledge that this thing is here, even in the situations where it's a sort of a like a quote negative emotion. So like you might be sad about something, but if you're not if you don't have this sort of fixated quality around the sadness, like that you're trying to push it away or something, then you can just like feel sad and actually you don't suffer. Like it's just like another one of these emotions, and it can be quite sweet. Like there can be a sweet kind of sadness or anger. Like a lot of people think like, oh, anger is bad because it's this very like blind rage and that sort of thing. But actually, if you don't have the blind part of the rage, then it's actually just really fun. It's like, yes, I can see things clearly, and this boundary should be drawn, and that sort of stuff. And so you are not blocking out the rest of the world when you're inhabiting whatever the emotion is. And so this is the same as the thing in meditation of equanimity. So it's that you are treating all of these different emotions or situations as like equally something that you can feel and think into, which again ties right back down to the non-coercive, non-authoritarian thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because I always again thought of like this main principle of Buddhism being desire is the root of all suffering, and that just you should switch off this thing called desire. But yeah, that's pretty interesting how you discovered that it actually means something different translated into.
I've heard, I should say that that apparently depends on which version of Buddhism, and there are some that, you know, basically take that different translation, because I think the original word means something like thirst or craving or something like that. And so there have been lots of different types of Buddhisms, but the one that's popular on Twitter is this one that's more about fixation.
Cool. And so again, switching gears a bit, you have this YouTube video. You're wearing the color purple now, and in that video you explain why purple is your favorite color, and you talk about why constraints help creativity. So usually we relate the word creative to, you know, this unboundedness, no limitations, absolutely free. But constraints, like the rules of chess, for example, allow a person to have fun. And without the force of gravity, it would be pretty hard to play a game of basketball. So there's plenty of examples that support this idea that constraints are actually good for you, except for the kind that are coercive or they suppress criticism. So like dogmas or taboos, these kinds of constraints have an unproductive effect. So yeah, I just like to hear your thoughts on constraints being helpful and how they fit into this framework of freedom that I think you and I both deeply care about.
Yeah. My favorite example is that the constraints in poetry, like if you think about classical poetry where it has rhyme and meter, I generally, I mean, it depends on the poems. Like different poems can be good in different ways, but I generally find poems that have structure and yet somehow fit the words in exactly right, and somehow it feels and whatever. I find those a lot more engaging. And so it's something like, to do any kind of thinking, you need to have criteria for the thoughts, like what counts as a thought that meets your problem, or what is interesting. And then you were asking about the constraints. So yeah, so what is the thing that happens when it's coercively constraining? I think I would say it is when there is a force that is preventing you from using creativity. Like maybe it's even something like when creativity is being used to thwart your creativity. So instead of it is a static problem and once I've solved it, it's gone and then I can work on the next problem, it's a problem that sort of adapts to meet like whatever you're trying to do. And so no matter what you do, you keep running into a wall. I wrote this less wrong post about beware something like coping strategies or something, and I gave this example of if there's a rock in your path and you trip over a rock, then that's one thing. That's sort of that's nature. You don't necessarily feel sort of aggrieved by the rock. But if you're walking along and then the rocks like jump in front of your feet, like just as you're about to take a step, then that's annoying, because now you are working against this creative force of these magic rocks in order to like do anything. And so maybe that's where the bad type of coercion comes into it.
Right. And so the rules of chess being a example of productive constraint, the rules of chess are one thing, but if someone forces me to play chess, so the rules are there, but and I have fun playing the game, but if someone forces me against my will to play chess, then that's again a constraint that's perhaps not really good. That's so.
Yeah, and then there I would say that it's the person who's forcing you to play chess, and then all of the, like, I don't know how they're forcing you, whether they have a gun or whether they're your parent or like whether, you know, it's a school situation, but whatever that structure is the coercive unpleasant thing, and then the chess is sort of like somewhat arbitrary.
So do you not think that the rules of chess, or like some rules, really have to be kind of fine-tuned and to be a particular way in order for them to be fun or engaging?
I think it maybe it depends. Like I can imagine a group of friends who are like, let's invent a new board game, and then
Mhm.
they come up with rules, and like it's fun to play with these crap rules for a while. And then I can imagine, that thing that they came up with in 30 minutes being made a mandatory part of the school curriculum, and then suddenly it's because then you're learning less from it, and then so maybe there's less interesting thing, and maybe it's more busy work. On the other hand, if it's sort of sufficiently simple, then maybe it's better because then you can be thinking about other things while you're doing it. So I would separate out the coercive element from the what makes something interesting and good element.
Do you have like any idea of how schools could, or just this whole education thing could start being more liberal or more voluntary, and how they could just go into this direction of non-coercion?
Yeah, there are already so-called free schools, which are basically like school buildings where you can go, and they have sort of varying degrees of rules, but much more freedom than regular schools. Um, so there's I mean, so if you've got like home education on one side and school on the other, there's things like Montessori, which is like kind of a school. It's like more on the school end than the home education end, but it's sort of better than like school. And then there's things like Summerhill and Sudbury Valley, which are more kind of free schools and they're sort of like in the middle. And then there's the sort of home education. And um, I mean, given that we have the internet, like I've been saying this since I was a kid, which was like the 90s. Like we've had good enough internet to educate people for a while. And so I think the problem, like there are lots of practical problems. There's like uh parents working and having time to be around and child sitting. There's things like meeting people and socializing. But in terms of the actual education part, I don't think we need a school system. I don't think we need to design anything. I think people following their own interests and picking up from the culture effective ways of pursuing those, like, oh, you can find message boards, you can find a community of practice, you can find people who are trying things out, you can find experiments you can do, you can write about it, you can do all of these different things. I think like so long as you have access to culture, which everyone does because everyone is on the internet, then like the education part I think is mostly like good. Like we've mostly got that done.
Okay. And now with AI and ChatGPT, I think that's just getting even better than
Yeah,
perhaps
exactly.
the 90s, or yeah.
Yeah.
Lastly, I just want to hear your thoughts on the whole community that's forming around critical rationalism. I really like it, but obviously, I do think like there's some tendency whenever something like kind of becomes a community or a group, and again, critical rationalism is just so against, calling it Popperian or Deutschian or again, critical rationalism again, so the ism. But just what do you think about the ideas? The ideas are spreading, and if you like, a lot of people are getting into it, but obviously not as much as I think we'd want. I definitely want more people to become aware of these ideas, but yeah, how do you think about the community that's forming around critical rationalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think the what you call it debate is a kind of a red herring. I think it's a hullabaloo about nothing basically. Um, and the actual thing is that um, there's currently no centralized hub for critical rationalism. Like there are like a ton of like sort of tiny groups. Like Less Wrong became a very popular community and had a lot of things coming out of it and did a lot of good stuff because it had a website that was the community website, that if you wanted to be in the community, you would go to that website. There would be a sequence of posts that you would read so that you would understand basically what other people are talking about. And it worked really well, really well. And I think there have been a lot of people sort of like trying to create a more centralized community for critical rationalists. My personal favorite is the Invariants. That they have a podcast and they also have a Discord, and I just love their community.
Okay.
But there hasn't been kind of like one place. Like basically it's Twitter, which is a bit of a Wild West anyway. And so I think this is more about just like community organizing. Like the types of people who get attracted to critical rationalism mostly happen to not be community organizer type people. And so we're only recently seeing that pop up. So Logan Chipkin is having a meetup in June. So anyone listening to this, you should definitely come to that. I'll be there. So so I think it's more a kind of accident of how communities have evolved out of the thing.
Lulie, thank you so much for your time. Before I let you go, what are some books/resources you might suggest for people who are inspired by this conversation and perhaps want to delve firstly deeper into epistemology and then resources for the kind of stuff we talked about with mindfulness and Alexander technique?
Yeah, I'm instead of recommending books, I'm going to recommend first of all a podcast, which is the Invariants podcast. I think if you're coming to critical rationalism, especially from like either the Bayesian or effective altruist direction, then I don't think that podcast can be beat.
It's the first time I'm actually hearing about it.
Oh, really?
I've heard of Increments, which is pretty nice. I think you've been on there as well. But Invariants, that's the first time.
Oh, sorry, not Invariants. Increments. Yeah, sorry. Okay. That was my brain just did a math. Anyway.
All right. Yeah. So it's the Increments podcast. Okay.
Yes. No, Invariants is the Math Society in Oxford University. That's why I got confused there.
Okay.
Yeah, apologies for that. But yeah, so that one on the epistemology stuff, and then for the mindfulness stuff, I don't know. I mean, I guess I would say the Alexander technique post on my blog on lulie.co.uk would be, that's the kind of the closest thing that I can think of that is an epistemology first look into what is this Alexander technique thing. I'm intending to write more posts about connecting critical rationalism to the mindfulness stuff, but they're not up yet. But I will pin them to my pinned tweets when I do write them.
Cool, amazing. Thanks again, Lulie. This was a lot of fun. We should do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.